Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage, and you're joining us today on the podcast, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. And today my guest is Tamsen Webster. She has spent nearly 20 years helping experts drive action from their ideas. She's part message strategist, part storyteller, part English to English translator. Her work focuses on how to find and build the stories partners, investors, clients, and customers will tell themselves and others. She's also the author of a book that came out fairly recently called Find Your Red Thread. And she's honed her expertise working with major companies, Johnson & Johnson, Harvard Medical School. She's done a TED Talk and a TEDx. And she was a reluctant marathoner twice. And of course, is a champion ballroom dancer in her mind. So,
Yes.
and she learned everything she needs to know about managing people by being a Weight Watchers leader. So there's lots of stuff in there, multi-talented and multi-interested.
I don't know about talented, but
Okay. Well,
easily
multiple
distractible,
interests.
perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
there we go.
Yeah, right. It's right. Well, that's French for ADD, right?
That's right. Yes, multi-talented.
Yes,
We're just going to call it that.
So, welcome aboard. So, this was your first book, right? The one that
It
recently
was,
came,
yes.
Red Thread.
Yes.
So
I like how you put it as first. Like, oh, there's more coming. Maybe there are.
Well, no, not necessarily, but I'd love to get just sort of a high level recap of what the experience was now that you're on the other side of this, meaning, hey, I went into this expecting X, Y, and here's where it met those expectations, and here's where things that were totally different than what I had thought would happen.
You know, I think I had the big shift in how I thought about it when at the moment where I realized that I didn't have to be like Malcolm Gladwell or Dan Pink or, Seth Godin or whatever. Like I think because it was my first book, I think it's very tempting to think that particularly if you're in business and it's a business oriented book, I think it's tempting to think that you have to have like the biggest, newest, broadest idea that ever was. And then it has to be this like big book that like talks about it with all the stories. And then I have a good friend of mine, an amazing mentor, Ann Handley. She's the chief content officer at Marketing Pros. And, I told her how I was struggling to figure out, like, I just had major blocks against writing this book. And she said to me, Tamsen, write the book that's easiest to write. And I was like, that's easy. That's just how I do what I do. And, what I've discovered.
There for a minute because
of course.
Stay there for a minute because I think that's an amazing insight or observation in that I call it the curse of the expert, right? So there are things that you do better than almost anyone, right? Yet what writing a book does, it forces you to actually decode how you do it, right? And I always say, like, the way you prove that is if I were over there now, I'd say, let's go in the kitchen and make a peanut butter sandwich, but we'd have to document all of the 131 steps. And you'd say, you know what? You're out of your mind. I've done it 1,000 times before. Can't be that many steps. And we have to, because you don't think about it. This is fast brain, slow brain. So I think part of what's interesting from an intrinsic perspective of the benefit of writing a book, it forces you to really sort of do an x-ray of your brain and say, this is how I do the thing that I do that everybody values. I didn't even know how I did that and the steps that I took.
Well, what's funny is I actually had the opposite because that was the thing that was clear to me from the get-go. Like, because I my process was one that I had developed and tested and had been, for the 5 years prior to capturing it in a book. And the funny thing is that, as I was saying, that didn't feel big to me, right? Like in the moment, it didn't feel big to me to say, well, because I was just like, well, this is just my process. Like, I know what it is. I know what the steps are. I know how to argue, for it. I know how to walk people through it. I know what's been most effective with my clients. But it was realizing that was enough. Like that actually in and of itself, that there is a
so you felt you had to put more in there because that was so simple.
I did at the beginning. And that was what was just kind of overwhelming to me. I was just like, but I really, a lot of it came, as I think writing books can, from just getting really clear about who it was for and what I wanted them to be able to do with it. And I was like, this is for people who are at that point of struggle of articulation of their ideas, no matter what it might be. Like they have the big idea, or an idea. It doesn't even have to necessarily be big from the world standpoint.
But I think that less is more, because I think the books that become a burden to read, which means nobody wants to read them or finish them, or somebody had good intent. They wanted to try to get their whole, 30 years of experience into all this. I have so much to say and everybody can benefit from it, whatever. And it's like, whoa, like I have to digest this, right? Like it's like let me take a couple of bites, and if I can take a couple of ideas from a book. I mean, I did a piece this morning with someone where we're talking about, well, what's the exchange rate for a book? And I'm like, yeah, it's $25. Who cares? I don't really care about $25. I've wasted that and much more on other things. It's 6-hour investment of my life. And if I'm putting 5 or 6 hours into something, I better get a return. Now, the return isn't, it's going to change my life, but if I can add one tool or one thought or one model that I use on occasion, that's a fair exchange. I'm happy with
Yeah,
that.
I love that
I'm delighted
approach.
with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I wanted. I wanted a book that was useful. And as I said, as it turns out, that it has ended up being fairly big, mostly because to the point that you were bringing up, and rightly so, a lot of people have the idea, but they don't have how do you operationalize the idea? And so for me, I was like, well, I know that's the piece that I do over and over again, whether it's my own stuff or anybody else's. Like that's what I know how to do. And people have responded really well to, oh, this is a book I can actually use, right? Like this is a book that actually tells me how to do this. It doesn't just say why this is important or that this, it tells a whole bunch of stories about it. I mean, I could, and that was what I decided not to do. Just went and did it.
You've got to give the least amount of the theoretical that is necessary to build your case to get into the applied, because people, not that they don't care about the theoretical, but I can't spend 100 pages on the theoretical before I got into, you still haven't held my hand and showed me what's in this for me, if you will. Cool.
Yeah, exactly. So, that even affected how I structured the book, because all the theoretical stuff is like in the first chapter. And then the rest of the book is the, how do we do this? But even that informed how I structured the chapters, because I wanted the chapters to be almost journalistic style, right? Where it would start with, if you just want like what to do, here it is. And then I put all the theoretical stuff for the individual steps like after it. So it's like, oh, here's what it is. Here's how you do it. Okay, if you want to understand more about why this is the way that it is, or if you're struggling with it,
that's kind of the double click
isn't
model,
enough. Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So it's kind of the double. Yeah, interesting. So let's go on a little bit of a different track. So that was sort of the process of writing the book. Now it's, some period of time, a good period of time, half a year plus later since the book's been out.
Yeah.
What's been the impact on the business, the brand? Are you finding net new clients? Are you being invited to, sort of engagements that you wouldn't have professionally? Like what if anything's changed?
I mean, I think so. The most immediate effect is that it's extended the rings of people who know about me and my work, right? So I get, prior to this, I would say that my business is almost 100% word of mouth, or my going and presenting someplace about something. And then, so people have had either a direct connection to me, or, I think up until the book, I would call it third rung, like someone I'd worked with talks to somebody else, and then that person gets referred in. And I would say after the book, there's a lot more people that have had no connection to either that second or third rung of people. And they're just, somebody somehow they've gotten a hold of the book, and then they come to me and they're like,
okay, so
I just got
stay
this
there
book.
for a minute.
I'm really interested in this.
Yeah, because I think that's an important piece you're touching on there, in that your business always used to be referral, once removed, twice removed, whatever, and probably fairly predictable in terms of at the end of the year, this year a little bit better than last year. You might not know the X number of gigs you're working with, Y number of people, but that's sort of the dividends that you get from being really good at what you do over a period of time. But now you're getting, quote, stranger, right?
Yes.
People that aren't sort of, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, which that's a good validation, right? That it's
I'm thrilled.
There's reason.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if all you got were the same people coming to you saying, hey, I was going to hire you anyway, but hey, thanks for writing that damn book. Like, whatever.
Right.
Any surprises?
That's the thing. And I get people reaching out on social and all these things. They're like, hey, I just picked up your book. And I'm like, I don't know who these people are. And I'm like, that's delightful for me. That's exactly, I did write it for people who had some form of contact for me, but I'm delighted that people who don't know me are finding it as a useful introduction to.
So any surprises along those lines on who, not by name, but the type or use case or whatever? Like sometimes you'll find out like, oh, there was a school superintendent in Cleveland that applied. Like, whoa, never would have figured that out. Like when you unleash the power of an idea into the universe.
I would say no wild surprises in that the folks that are most likely to pick up a book like that are are folks that are generally thinking about their own stuff, right? So a lot of the kind of 6+ degrees of separation or whatever it might be are folks that are working on their own individual ideas. And rather than they're thinking about it as in the form of their organization or their company's ideas. Those folks, the ones I'd say, the one that was most surprising, was a faith-based university in the upper Midwest, who was like, oh, this is interesting. Could this help us? That was more of a direct contact because they saw me present at a higher education marketing conference. But, I love the variety of people who find this approach helpful. I mean, I've always known that it can be applied in a whole bunch of different ways, from investor pitches to TED Talks to all this other stuff. But it's been fun seeing people go, I know you wrote it for this, but can I use it for that? Because it sure seems like I can. And I'm like, oh, absolutely. Any good publisher makes you say it's for this, right? So I'm delighted that people see the idea and then have been able to map it over to their own use cases.
And I think that's the cool stuff that happens, is that people, oh, I didn't realize you could use a hammer to open a bottle of wine. Never thought of that. I guess okay, you could, not really what it was designed for. And you just sort of see what happens.
Off-label use. Yeah.
Off-label use. Yes. Right. Consult your physician and, whatever.
Right.
If you're enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about our podcast, please leave us a review and share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcast and on all major listening apps, as well as at thoughtleadershipleverage.com/podcasts. Any new lines of business that it's taken you into, in terms of, I used to only do X and Y, and now I'm doing some other different business models coming?
Yeah, I mean, it's solidifying. It's solidifying some lines of business that I had wanted to build. So, which was part of the intent of writing the book in the first place. So it's solidifying lines of business around startup accelerators and those kinds of things, I wanted that to happen. Sure. Because a lot of those kinds of accelerators, they on behalf of the companies that are in those accelerators and incubators, they understand the value that go-to-market messaging will have, which is one of the applications of the red thread approach. And a lot of those accelerators and incubators don't have a good curriculum for that. And so what this is established
becomes the de facto curriculum.
Becomes the de facto curriculum. And it's just, I work with one, my main client in that area is an accelerator called Elemental out of the Bay Area and Oahu. I'm looking forward to going to visit them in person again soon.
Many times in Oahu, yes. We should hope. Right.
But I think that's been interesting. I think getting into, one of the things that I'm launching this year is an accreditation program that's designed very much for agencies, so that, and other folks who want to use the approach with their own clients, right? So a lot of folks that are in the same kind of position that I am, of working with people on their messages and not just on their own. So I think that's going to be something that opens up a lot more too, because I have consistently over the years had inquiries from agencies asking whether or not I license the approach. And I'm delighted that this year I can finally say yes, actually.
Yeah, and licensing is a phenomenal business model. And, with it, like any other business, there's some pluses and minuses and cautions you've got to take, et cetera. But it is a great way to scale, to get more, you get your ideas out there. Obviously the concerns are they delivering in a high quality way? Are they honoring the integrity of the intellectual property, et cetera? But it's and from the buy side, it's really cost effective, right? Bringing you in is fairly expensive. Getting folks to deliver it to their peers and colleagues, et cetera, far better. So that's been new for you. So that's a new learning curve. And I love those sort of things. I love watching what people do with the same IP, right? So it's like we went into the kitchen and we've got the same ingredients. Like, oh, you want it in licensing? Oh, we make the recipe this way. You want it, and we price it that way, and we, sell it that way and distribute it that way. So it's interesting. The agency side, that would make sense that they want to use it. And then, then some of the questions would become, well, are you licensing it to them for internal use? Or are they able to use it as a tool on the client side? Like those are all levers that impact pricing.
Yeah, and the intent is to enable people, like, this is the way to be able to use it with client, external clients that outside of that, right? If you're using it without accreditation, then you would be violating both my copyright and my trademark. So it's giving people a legal means to do that, because the approach is written for you to use on your own stuff. And obviously I want companies to be able to use it on their,
of course.
But if anybody is using it to make money for themselves, then that's, these are all the things that I've learned. That's a violation of copyright. And so that's, and I had a very good friend, I even think 3 or 4 years ago, her name is Sylvie DeGiusto. And she was the one who has said, if you're going to write a book, also plan to have an accreditation or a certification or a licensing program come really close on its heels, because you'll see people, and I have seen some of this, people say, oh yeah, I use it with my clients all the time. And I've, there's been a couple of times where I'm like, okay, we actually need to talk about that, because if you're using it,
but the
you're
good
charging
news, bad
people
news
to use it in a way that they could have hired me. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Peter.
So I've seen that a lot, actually. And I think there's a good news, bad news there, right? So the good news is, okay, they found value in it. And if you assume good intent, we'll put a question mark around that in certain instances. They want to bring it out to others. Now, I also would say the burden is on the thought leader to provide the market with the various tools. Not that it gives people, rights to steal things from other people, if you will, or use things outside of their way. But if you make it easy and say, hey, here's the other way, great. Now, if people then choose to violate it, that's different. That's right. That's just not nice and illegal and exactly. All those other things.
Yeah, and it's one of those interesting things that you start to learn about, because I applied for and received the trademark on the Red Thread 3-4 years ago, and so part of maintaining that trademark, which you have to do every 5 years, is show defense of it. And so it's actually one of those things where even if sometimes it's kind of uncomfortable to reach out to someone and say, yeah, you mentioned you're using it with clients. Can we talk about that? Like in this case, this happened with somebody who I'm friendly with, and we have a respectful relationship, and the intent was good. But I was like, listen, I have to send you something that says we need to talk about how you can do this legally. Otherwise, like, I start to degrade my own ownership of the trademark.
But I would say that most people, once they understand that they've crossed a line, because most people, listen, 5%
most people don't even know. They don't even know that they're not supposed to do that. Yeah, exactly. They're just like, well, it's here, I can use it, right? And like,
exactly. Most people, when you let them know, particularly when they're in, they're using it for commercial gain or inside of an organization, like, ooh, they're apologetic, and then they want to do the right thing. So, okay, sure, sign 100%. Me up, and so I think that's really interesting. The question becomes, what is the cost of enforcement? And, is that how you want to spend your time tracking people? There's a whole other can of worms there, but, by and large, licensing is a really, really viable model.
It gives people a safe on-ramp, right? Or off-ramp for whatever they're doing. Because they say either, you've got a choice, like you can do it this way or not, or just use it for your own stuff. But if you're going to use it with other clients, then this is the way that you can do that.
Exactly.
Ethically and legally.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Any other insights, words of wisdom that you would share with somebody else that's maybe where you were 2-3 years ago, in thinking about a book, but not on the other side here? It's like basically giving a pregnant woman parenting advice.
I mean, I would go back to something I said earlier, which is that what made it, once I took Anne's advice and was like, well, what's the easiest book to write? The reason why it was easy to write a how-to book was because I had done the work of testing this out for, by the time I wrote the book, I'd been using this approach for 4.5, 5 years. That made it easy. And I think and I see this because of the nature of the clients that I work with. A lot of times people come to work with me when they're thinking about writing a book and they're trying to figure out what the idea is. That one of the things that can make writing a book really hard is if you haven't done that deep thinking about exactly what is this idea. It's kind of back to your saying with, it sounds easy to make a peanut butter sandwich until you actually have to explain all the different parts. Or, you think how a bike works or a toilet flushes until you're actually like, no, wait, actually, I don't know. Like beyond like I pedal or beyond that I, turn the plunger. When we actually said, but actually, how does it work? That's much more complicated. And I find ideas are the same way, where you have this great idea and you're like, this is the right idea. And then if you haven't done that thinking of, okay, but how does it actually work? Why does it actually work? Why is it actually the right idea, the right answer to a particular question, or the right solution to a particular problem? Outside of features and benefits, which is where our brains will go first.
No. Right. No, you're talking about getting under the hood and the right. How do you make the sausage? Right.
Understanding that before you write will make it so much easier, because just the process of really understanding really the path that your own brain took to come up with the idea means it's much, much easier to lay down stones on that same path so that your readers can follow along behind you. But if you're trying to figure it out at the same time that your readers are,
you're both going to lose.
That's exactly. tough. That's tough. And I think that doesn't lead to great books. I mean, it's just,
right.
I have read plenty of books that felt like the book itself was the exploration of the idea, that they wrote the book to figure it out, rather than the book was the product of a figured out idea. And I think that, you were talking before about the investment of time. If someone's going to invest 3, 4, 5, 6, 12 hours in reading your book, I think they should come out of it with more than just, thanks for bringing me along for the ride. Right. That's me.
No, they should come out with a nugget or two that they're excited to experiment with and try and integrate into what they do in some meaningful way. I want them to come out changed.
That's I want them, I talk about this as the bar that I try to set when I'm working with my clients on messages, is we want to create something that people can't unhear. Not just isn't that interesting? But I really, I try to set as a bar, how do we fundamentally shift how people are looking at this whole thing?
And they would never look at a similar problem the same way they used to before.
The same way. So when it comes up again, they're like, oh, right. Okay. This is this thing happening again. Or when some competitor tries to come in and they're like, yeah, but what about this? And then the competitor doesn't have an answer to that. That's where you really want to get to, particularly if you're working with or thinking about messages in terms of your own organization, right?
No, perfect. Well, this has been fantastic. I wish you the best, and thank you for sharing your journey with us, Tamsen. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Peter.
To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.